When Peter is trying to cut down a tree and suddenly water comes flowing out of it at a rapid pace, his first instinct is to call the fire department, but he never expected them to arrive as quickly as they did. It was obvious that they took this very seriously. Peter just could not understand why, but it would become clear when his whole property was quarantined. Peter could barely believe it when the firemen told him that he needed to pack up his thighs and leave his property within the hour. Why the hell did they need to quarantine everything because there was water coming out of a tree? Peter and his family demanded an explanation, but neither the firemen nor their captain was in a position to give it to them. When Peter got the explanation for what he found and why his property was being quarantined, it finally all made sense to him. There had indeed been no other option. But how did so much water just come flowing out of a lone tree? And why was this such a big deal to the local authorities? But before we start our story, smash the like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Peter was no stranger to cutting down trees. His massive property held enough trees to keep him in business forever. But luckily for the trees, Peter only needed a few of them each winter to keep his fireplace full and to keep him warm. He'd never had any issues with this until today. Peter's property included a vast forested area, too large to explore on foot, so he typically used his truck to navigate the worn paths. Every year, Peter ventured into the forest to gather firewood. This year's trip, however, would be unlike any before. Peter avoided using chainsaws. He found them noisy and risky, preferring his reliable axe instead. With it in hand, he drove to the forest, ready to work. Choosing the right trees was a thoughtful process. Peter needed enough firewood for winter, but aimed to preserve the forest's natural balance. He carefully selected trees of different species, spaced apart and never from the forest's edge. He didn't want the look of the forest to be changed too much. All he was doing was trimming it down, as he said. There had been one tree that Peter had been eyeing up to cut down for a while now. He wasn't quite prepared to cut it down yet, telling himself that if he let it grow just for another year, that it would be big enough to last him several winters. He'd been telling himself that for years, but today was the big day. The tree in question was a big oak tree, and over the years of growing, Peter was determined to cut it down today. He was concerned about having the best equipment. He'd bought better axes, some that were shaper and bigger. He'd even thought about buying or borrowing a chainsaw, but decided against it. In truth, Peter didn't want to buy the better equipment. He still believed in his trusty axe, but after talking with friends and professionals, he knew that to be safe, he needed to use the best tools possible, or at least the best non-mechanical tools. He would not be using a chainsaw, but that didn't mean this wouldn't be dangerous. Peter finally pulled up to the big oak tree. It was bigger than the last time he'd checked on it. Taking it in, he felt almost a sense of pride, but he needed the firewood. Taking out one of his new axes, he started striking the tree, but this was where things started to go epically wrong. Strike after strike, Peter laid into the tree, but he didn't seem to be making much of a dent. He put some more muscle into it and continued chopping. It still made too little of a difference. Peter began to wonder if maybe he'd overestimated his skills. That wasn't the only thing he'd overestimated. Peter backed up a bit and swung powerfully, giving it everything he had. It finally made a deep strike into the tree, but still, it wasn't enough. It was indeed a bit of a starting point. If he could cut it deeper, he'd be able to push the tree down, but that was going to take a lot of strength and a lot of time. He continued to strike the tree with a lot of force, but it wasn't until the third strike that he hit it just right. Perhaps this new axe was the right tool after all, and maybe it was time to give up his old, trusty axe. Peter stuck his axe into the cut on the tree and turned it a bit, pulling the bark off, creating a small hole. Peter stood closer to the tree, trying to see into the hole. It appeared that the tree might actually be hollow throughout. He was about to strike the hole with his axe again, but never got the chance. He couldn't have had any idea what was about to happen next, but it was going to change everything. Before Peter could even get a proper look into the hole, water came bursting out at a rapid pace. It was as if someone had turned on the garden hose at the highest power. Peter had to jump back to stay dry, but mostly it was from confusion. How was it that a tree had turned into a fountain? The grass around the tree was flooding and turning into thick mud. If Peter didn't move his truck fast, it would get stuck in the mud. But how far back did he need to move it? Just how much water was going to come out of this tree? Peter had no idea, but he needed to act fast before his truck got stuck. Peter moved his truck far up the road and decided to walk back to the tree, or rather run back. When he finally got back to the tree, it was as if the water had gotten faster. Peter didn't know what to do. His entire property was going to flood if he couldn't stop this tree from flowing. But what could he do? With nothing else coming to mind, Peter called the fire department. If anyone knew how to handle water, it would be them. Peter wasn't sure they'd even show up for something like this, but once they heard the situation, he was quite surprised by their response. He'd have to get moving. The fire department was sending several trucks to his property and a big fire truck. Peter wasn't exactly sure why, but it seemed that they were taking this situation very seriously, which Peter was actually thankful for. He didn't want his property to flood, but he still wasn't sure how the fire department would solve this problem. Peter was told on the phone that he needed to get as far away from the tree as possible. Together, they decided on a place to meet on the property, one of the old roads that were closest to the tree, but far enough away too. Peter was able to snap a quick photo of the water-spouting tree before he left, but then he was off. The fire truck arrived at the edge of his property before Peter did. He could hear them coming from down the road. Their sirens were on, and so were the flashing lights. They had obviously raced here, but why? It was an unusual predicament, but couldn't they just stop it with a plug of some kind? Why were they so worried? No less than 6 firemen jumped out of the truck. Along with them came the fire chief. The chief approached Peter and asked him for directions to the tree, but the small trail of water flowing around the property was path enough. The firemen head to the tree, but Peter was told to stay back. The chief wanted to hear his story. Peter wanted to follow the firemen and help out if he could. After all, it was his home at risk and he didn't want to leave all the work to the others. But the chief is insistent that he stay behind and explain himself. Peter tells the story and waits in turn for an explanation from the chief on what the firemen would do. But no good explanation came. All they said was that they were quarantining the property as soon as possible. They would allow Peter an hour to go back to his house and collect his things and family to leave for at least a week. Peter can't believe it, but can't really argue with the chief of the firehouse. Peter has a lot of questions, but clearly the chief isn't in an answering mood. He quickly stalked off to join the firemen, leaving Peter to drive to the house. He called his wife, Melinda, on the drive and told her to start packing. He said he'd explain everything when he got back, but his wife wanted answers now. Peter wasn't even sure where his family would go, but knew that they needed to start packing and fast. At exactly an hour later, the firemen were at the door, insisting that Peter and his family needed to leave immediately. Peter was willing to go, but Melinda wasn't taking a step until she had an explanation. After about 10 minutes of arguing, Melinda relented, and the family left their property. As they drove away, Peter noticed that the water flow had stopped, and firemen were erecting a tent around the tree. What was going on? Curious locals had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of a fire truck lingering in the area. Speculation ran wild, but the firemen remained tight-lipped, keeping everyone at a distance. Many had seen water coming from the tree, but nobody could explain it. When asked, the firemen gave vague answers. The family decided to stay with Melinda's parents just outside of town. The firemen assured them they could return home in a week, but Peter was too restless to. Determined to uncover the truth, he planned to sneak back that night. When he arrived, he found the site heavily guarded, even at night. Disappointed, he returned to Melinda's parents' home, resolved to take another approach. Peter knew the fire department commander through their tennis club. The commander had always been a trusted family friend. Hoping for answers, Peter called him the next morning. Reaching him was difficult. Calls went to voicemail or were deflected by others. When Peter finally got through, the commander reluctantly asked him to come to the station. At the station, Peter was directed to an office where the commander awaited him. Spread across the table was a detailed map of the neighborhood, including Peter's property. However, the map seemed old, depicting something unusual beneath his land. The commander explained the situation. Beneath Peter's property lay a hidden basin, essentially a vast underground lake replenished by groundwater. The government treated it as an emergency water reserve for droughts, but never expected it to be discovered by accident. Cutting the tree had created an opening that released built-up pressure in the basin, causing the unexpected flooding. To keep this hidden resource a secret, the government initially hesitated to inform Peter. However, the discovery posed a unique problem. Technically, the basin was on Peter's land, giving him a degree of ownership over the water. This presented a legal and financial challenge for the government. Peter used the situation to his advantage, negotiating a deal. In exchange for waiving any claim to the water, the government agreed to restore his property after the water damage. Satisfied with the arrangement, Peter felt justice was served. The government began regular checks on the basin to prevent future incidents. What had started as a puzzling mystery turned into a resolved issue, leaving everyone with an unusual story to tell.